Hey, welcome to the channel. My name is Jason, and here I talk about all things story. And the story I'm talking about today is, well, it's not so much a story. It's the first nonfiction book I have yet to review on this channel, and it is titled Zen in the Art of Writing by none other than Mr. Ray Bradbury. So before I begin the review or discussion, I would like to tell a little story about Ray Bradbury and what he means to me, I guess, and how I discovered him. And if you don't want to hear this story, use the chapter selection. I will mark it for you when I start talking about the book itself. When I was a kid in the 80s, there was a show called the Ray Bradbury Theater, and you saw this old man kind of in his study, hunkered around his toys. I think he called it his imagination workshop or something like that. But that was the intro of the show, and he had these really thick glasses, and he was just peering around at all these strange objects, and he would grab one, and that would be the beginning or what inspired the episode you were about to see. And so it is an anthology story, and Ray Bradbury is best known for his short stories. So as you might guess, a lot of these episodes were adapted from his short stories, and I really miss those kinds of shows, those anthology shows. There's a lot of them in the 80s. Ones about monsters and the hitchhiker and all sorts of stuff. But that was my first exposure to Ray Bradbury, and I love the imagination he had, the worlds he created, and there was a very human element to his storytelling. Little did I know that many years later I would be influenced so much by him, and I feel like my stories are rooted in humanity and just our interactions and really how our emotional core drives narrative. So moving on, I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Ray Bradbury. The year was 2006. I lived in the Valley of California, Bakersfield, California. Those of you who don't know that town, you're lucky. No, I'm just kidding. It's not that terrible. But I grew up there. I went to college there, and he came in the year of 2006 to speak at the university. So of course I went, and he was in a wheelchair. He was in his 80s, so not in the best health. But I thought it was really amazing how someone as old as him would still make the rounds, do these book signings in places as small and insignificant as somewhere like Bakersfield, California. But anyway, I remember watching a man push him up in the wheelchair onto the stage, and it was in a gymnasium, and he was kind of shriveled, he was kind of hunched over. But what came out of his mouth really amazed me. You could just see the passion in his eyes about storytelling. He talked about his life, his inspiration, where he saw humanity going. He talked a lot about our future and the stars, and it was almost as if he just completely transformed from that withered shell of a man into a young boy. And on that day, I was lucky enough to get 2 signed copies. My favorite of his being The Martian Chronicles, and of course I had to get the classic Fahrenheit 451. And I think when you see his signatures, you'll understand sort of his physical state at the time. It's barely a scrawl. You can see it right there. Barely legible whatsoever. Not to say that my signature is legible whatsoever. We were only allowed to have 2 books signed. I purchased both of these. I own these already, but I purchased the hardback editions at the signing. Because of his health, he was only going to sign 2 copies, and I'm so very glad I met this guy. It was very inspiring. Didn't really chat with him much, but said hi, got my signatures and was on my way. But I don't think I'll ever forget that speech. I wasn't really into writing back then, but I still think about it clearly, and it definitely inspires my work. And so I lament the fact that this book, Zen in the Art of Writing, sat on my shelf unread for many years. So this is where it begins. I'm going to start talking about this book now. This is where the review begins. And I don't know that I'm going to really score this book because it's not something that has narrative structure in the traditional sense. It's not about characterization or anything like that. It's really a collection of essays that he wrote over the years, spanning from, I believe, like the 50s or 60s all the way up into the 90s. And this book was published in 1994, very, very reminiscent of On Writing by Stephen King, which is another fantastic book. And you can tell that Stephen King, I'm sure, was inspired by how Ray Bradbury assembled this collection. So as I said, it's broken up into a number of essays. They're not chronological, so they do jump around in time. They're everything from how to keep a muse as a writer. And one thing I'd like to stress is this book isn't really just for writers. It's for anybody who is in the creative industry. So if you're an artist, a musician, a filmmaker, anything like that, you can definitely draw inspiration from this. And reading these essays really just shows you how passionate of a man he was about writing. And I can guarantee you that you'll be very inspired inspired by the words here. I found myself grinning so much because I just saw his excitement jumping off the page. So the first essay is called The Joy of Writing, and he talks about how it's important to write with speed and write from the gut. And you hear that a lot, right? You don't want to sit there and plod along. You want to kind of vomit stuff out. I've tried that way. I feel like there is strengths and weaknesses to it. And then another essay is called How to Keep and Feed a Muse. And he describes that, how to find the muse and how it is elusive, but how it is definitely something you can catch. And one of my favorite stories is called Investing Dimes Fahrenheit 451. And this is interesting because if you're a writer, I'm sure you know of the Pomodoro technique, and that's where you time yourself. You have a writing sprint. I'm guilty of doing writing sprints on streams here on YouTube. But what he had to do is he had to actually pay to rent a typewriter. So he would go to the library. I believe it was something like, Investing Dimes. It was 10 cents for, I can't remember how long it was, but it was a timer. So him using this typewriter actually cost him money. And so that was his incentive to write quickly, because he couldn't just sit there while this clock was ticking away and he was losing his money. So really interesting and fun story to read. And not only that, but it does document the history of Fahrenheit 451 and all of the iterations it went through, from plays to film. He talks about his novel Dandelion Wine as well, the making of that. The Long Road to Mars, which of course is the Martian Chronicles. On the Shoulders of Giants, where he talks about being inspired by all the ones who came before him. The Secret Mind, again, more techniques to sort of like pull the writing from your head. How, like what he recommends to inspire yourself with reading. And he actually recommended poetry, which I had never heard before, and I thought that was pretty interesting. So I'm thinking about trying to pick up some poetry and delve in. And the reason why he says that is because it deals strictly in metaphor and imagery. And so because poetry is so short, it has to convey a lot in very few words. And so that allows you to pull these ideas from them and create stories. And he confesses that many, many stories he's written had been inspired by poetry. And there's an interesting interview as well about him adapting Something Wicked This Way Comes into a film, and what the process was there and working with the director. So really finally it ends with a bunch of his poems that are definitely geared toward inspiring creativity. So I don't want to spoil every little story in here. There's a lot of great anecdotal stuff. There's a lot of great stuff that you can use to motivate yourself to write, to sit down and do it. And I'll tell you right now, reading this book definitely got me in the mood to write, and I think that's what it was geared for. It's not to teach you about grammar, it's not to teach you about story structure, it's to teach you about all of the other things that go into writing. Your work ethic, how you need to just sit down and crank the words out. Don't think too hard, let your gut do the writing, and just sit down every day and write. I think one of the interesting things about this book is he talks about his writing process, where he would create a story throughout the week. So he would sit down on one day, bust out the draft of a short story, the next day revise, and by the end of the week, he would send that story off for publication or to try to sell it into a literary journal. And I know a lot of you out there, myself included, we try to tell ourselves to write 1,000 words a day, 500 words a day, 2,000 words a day. Like Stephen King, he says he writes 2,000 words a day every day. And I think what's most interesting about this, as far as his technique goes, is he was kind of forced to do this. He was never a rich man young in life. He was able to amass a small fortune. I'm not sure how much he was worth. I'm sure it was a few million at least, because he was involved in film and TV and even Disney. He worked for Disney for a little while as a consultant. But this book is just chock full of a lot of things we need to remind ourselves of when sitting down and writing, like just doing the work. He stresses that we just need to sit down and do the work. Also, don't chase trends. He talks about that a lot in this. Write what you love. Don't think about success. Think about the story, think about the art, and then success will find you. That's what he says anyway. We'll see if that happens or not. But I really like the philosophies in this. I like the thought process. I like the exercises and sort of what you can glean from his anecdotal stories. And so I highly, highly recommend this book for any writer, any creative out there. I don't want to give it a formal score, like I said. I would say this is definitely a must read if you're into reading craft books. But before I go, I'd like to leave you with, actually, it's the first few bits of lines in the very first essay called The Joy of Writing. And this really gives you an idea of how he felt about writing and how you should feel about writing, how I should feel about writing. And it's just, honestly, I know as hard as it can be sometimes, you just need to find the love. You need to fall in love again with writing, and then everything else will be fine. So, zest, gusto. How rarely one hears these words used. How rarely do we see people living, or for that matter, creating by them. Yet if I were asked to name the most important items in a writer's makeup, the things that shape his material and rush him along the road to where he wants to go. I could only warn him to look to his zest, see to his gusto. And then a little bit later on the second page, he goes into, what has all this to do with writing the short story in our times? Only this. If you are writing without zest, without gusto, without love, without fun, you are only half a writer. It means you are so busy keeping one eye on the commercial market or one ear peeled for the avant-garde coterie that you are not being yourself. You don't even know yourself. For the first thing a writer should be is excited. He should be a thing of fevers and enthusiasms. Without such vigor, he might as well be out picking peaches or digging ditches. God knows it'd be better for his health. So, with those sage words of Ray Bradbury, I implore you to read this book if you are a creative of any type, writer or not. And Ray, I know you'll never hear this, but thanks again for being such an inspiring, creative person. And I'm sure I will come back to this book many, many times. So that said, if you'd like to see my own creative work, please check out my series Worth 1,000 Words, where I write a 1,000-word short story inspired by a piece of artwork. I also have novels. Check out the links in the description below. And thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.